I'm doing the Quest 3 video. After many comments requesting it, here we go. So we're going to be looking at the Quest 3 with and without SteamVR today, just like I did with the Pimax Crystal. Today we're going to be looking at 4 different methods, that being Steam Link, Virtual Desktop, Meta AirLink, and then wired USB with Meta software to see if wireless could be causing issues. So I'm not going to waste anyone's time. We're just going to jump right into some important disclaimers and the results here, because there's some essential ones that are going to contextualize them, and do not skip these for that reason. Firstly, I am only measuring FPS and frame time performance. I am not measuring the latency, as 3 out of the 4 methods here involve wireless streaming. I'm not enough of an expert to properly measure these, as while I know there are built-in tools to measure them in the respective software, I like to use the same tool for the measurement so I know that each result is measuring the exact same thing the same way. And I can't say measure Virtual Desktop's overlay to measure Steam Link. So it could be theoretically possible for something to perform better in FPS, but something with lower latency could be more responsive than it. Secondly, there were some major issues in certain games when testing the native Meta software. I generally disable motion smoothing or spacewarp techniques just to show the unconstrained FPS, since those cap what you can put out, but I had several cases where I would disable spacewarp in Meta software, but the game would simply not listen. It'd turn off for a few seconds, then back on for a bit, then off, which ruined the results because if I couldn't maintain 120 FPS at any point, it capped my frames to 60 FPS whenever it turned on. Like you're seeing on screen right now with Pavlov, where I was desperately trying to shut it off, but it simply wouldn't work. This only happened on native Meta software, both over AirLink or USB cable, and even on a second PC, and nothing I did worked. From reinstalling, purging other VR vendor software, nothing. I was a bit worried I was actually going to be able to find enough games to test between that, VR games being difficult to benchmark in fully identical scenarios, and actually trying to stress a 4090 is hard when you're not on one of the highest resolutions in the market. Games where the spacewarp bug happened will be noted, as it's still worth looking at those for those who don't like motion smoothing techniques, plus still important data comparing Virtual Desktop and Steam Link. Thirdly, you may see charts which look like they end at very different positions, like on screen right now, but this is only about a 1.5 second difference. I reran every test until they ended within, at most, about 3 to 4 seconds of each other, as with this software, I cannot see the runtime inside the headset, so I had to just manually stop things. The gap looks larger than it actually is. And fourth disclaimer brings us to the testing methodology and setup. Because each method has their own ways of controlling resolution and are identical on adjusting them, I did my best to try and match the resolutions and keep things fair, but because of those, I couldn't match per pixel on everything, since say Meta software doesn't let you go beyond a certain multiplier, Virtual Desktop only lets users use presets. The exact resolutions for everything used are on screen right now. The difference between the lowest resolution, Steam Link, and the highest, native Oculus mode, is 5.47%, which isn't much, but just bear that in mind because it is running a few percent higher than Steam Link and VD. Some games had an in-game resolution slider I used, since I could ensure each runtime was being multiplied the same way and make a game demanding enough I wasn't hertz limited. It'll be noted when I do that though. For the rest of my specs in the actual rig we're testing on, I have the 7950X3D, the 4090, 32GB of 6000 MHz CL30 DDR6 RAM, and a Netgear Nighthawk AXE 11000 Wi-Fi 6E router connected to my PC via wired Ethernet. Each method was tested at the max official settings possible, meaning Steam Link was tested with 350 megabytes per second, Meta software at 200 megabytes per second on wired or wireless, while Virtual Desktop was at 500 megabytes on H.264+. Higher encoding doesn't necessarily bring performance issues with it, provided your equipment can handle it at least. But the nature of wireless being a variable can bring with it some unpredictability with it, even on high-end equipment, and I'd like to briefly show why, alongside why I chose H.264+ on VD. Here's a brief showing of 3 codecs with VD, the 10-bit AV1 and HEVC at 150 megabytes per second, alongside H.264 Plus at 500 megabytes per second, as VD uniquely allows 3 different codecs versus Meta's 2 and Steam Link's 1. Here, using the same OpenVR runtime, AV1 is the worst performing in the 0.1% low, where the other two are about 14 to 18% better, and then average FPS, which is just 2 to 3%, and that's arguably run-to-run variance. But on 1% low, the 10-bit codecs are doing about 5 to 7% better, with AV1 doing the best. Flip over to the OpenXR runtime, though, and H.264 is up to several percent better in the 0.1% low, while on 1% low, the 10-bit codecs are 9 to 12% improved from it. But then the Steam OpenXR and H.264 is winning in 0.1% low by 5.4% versus AV1, and it's massacring HEVC by being 23% better. 1% low and average FPS are within 2%, and that's run-to-run variance, except H.264 is beating AV1 by about 5%. I ran my tests multiple times to try filtering outliers, but I saw some more run-to-run variance than I've seen before with a wired DisplayPort headset, that being my Crystal here, and the only reason I can think of is that the extra variables wireless does bring with it. I did chose H.264 since after thorough testing, it seemed a little bit more consistent, but it wasn't free of this. I ran it 5 more times, and average FPS plus 1% low were pretty rock steady. The largest gap being 3.6% on the 1% low, but the 0.1% low had 2 results doing much worse than the others, with the largest gap being almost 17%. If you filter out that lowest result as an outlier, that's still 11.6%, but only about 6 to 7% with the more average results. I didn't test every game, since that could be its own video, but with only one exception, I've not seen this wild variance between runs on a wired headset, especially because this section in Kayak VR is on rails to minimize any variance. So I've really tried as hard as I could to control as many factors as possible across the 3 different options, but there's only so much I can do, and there's a little more room for variance than usual because of this. But I think the general trends are still kind of going to be accurate. This is the best I could do. Sorry for all the disclaimers. Those all out of the way, let's get to the actual results. Since we just looked at Kayak on VD, let's start with that. This game supports both OpenVR, which is the default, via Steam, but it can also be run with OpenXR via the launch command -HMD equals OpenXR. I don't have OXR runs with Meta's software via Steam here, as when I tried to run it, I encountered a game-breaking bug where my head tracking was lagging and not right, so it gets a DNF there. Average FPS doesn't show much difference beyond a few percent, which will be somewhat of a trend, and I think I was very lightly hertz limited in some cases here, but the lows are where things get very interesting. Right away, you should notice how much Steam Link with OpenVR is blowing the hell out of everyone on the list. And I'd say the margins could be even greater because I was almost certainly hertz limited. I don't know why, but the 1% low with Steam Link was, even after doing multiple runs for validation, consistently higher than everyone else to a massive degree. It's doing 109 FPS when nobody else even breaks 90. Even the run with the second best 1% low on the whole chart, Virtual Desktop with Steam's OpenXR runtime, Steam Link with OVR beats it by 21%. The 0.1% lows aren't as disproportionately ahead, but it's still leading second place by a few percent and everyone else by a lot more. But if we look at the passes with OpenXR, there's something kinda off, and I think that its implementation within Kayak has something wrong with it. So I'm not sure if I'd say this is applicable to broader trends, but I have seen some odd OpenXR implementations before, so I believe this is still worth talking about. The reason I think this is Steam was always the best runtime, more specifically OpenVR, simply switching to OpenXR with Steam Link caused a massive performance drop, with the OVR runtime possessing 23 to 25% better lows. The difference is not as drastic with Meta's software, but it's still better to run OpenVR with Steam instead of the native OpenXR mode with both AirLink
and the cable, but the margins for it were quite different. Airlink saw around a 20 to 21% improvement on the lows with SteamVR's OpenVR runtime, whereas with the Link cable, margins were much lower, with only a 7.5% increase on 0.1% low, but almost 16% for the 1% low. For some reason, the best Airlink run had 14% better 0.1% low than using the cable, which you think wouldn't be the case since there's more general instability with wireless, but well, here we are. Interestingly, Virtual Desktop is unaffected in a meaningful way going from OpenVR to OpenXR, long as it's with Steam at least. Using VDXR, we see that SteamVR options do about 8 to 10% better on the 1% low, nearly hitting 90 FPS, while 0.1% low has an even higher margin of 13 to 17%. Given I've seen odd OpenXR behavior on 2 different headsets across several runtimes for this game, I just wouldn't advise anyone to use Kayak's OpenXR implementation. Because the gap is so wide, I do want to take a look at the frame times for Steam Link to try and explain it though. Checking the plot, it can be seen that OpenXR runtime has significantly more inconsistent spikes in its performance. OpenVR may have a few spikes as well, some even of similar size, but in general, it keeps a stable frame time even as OXR has numerous spikes, and the ones it does have of a similar caliber are far less in number, save for one outlier at about 160 seconds. Remember, lower is better with frame time because that means it's delivering the frames to your HMD faster. Unless I see something particularly interesting in the frame time plot though, I will not be highlighting every game like this as the FPS numbers give a good general idea of the experience if there's not some weird outlier. And next up is Project Wingman, which has a native Oculus, not OpenXR, mode I wanted to test. This was done with 150% in-game render scale. Here, the native meta software is doing really bad, and the worst out of everyone by every metric, and often to a notable degree. And there's some interesting things going on with it. SteamVR, with meta, cabled or wireless, has 0.1% lows around 10 to 13% better than using the native Oculus OpenVR runtime. But the Oculus runtime's 1% low improved by a similar to slightly greater margin. But both Steam Link and VD completely destroy them here, even considering Oculus is running a few percent higher resolution. The 1% low for it are about on par with the native Oculus mode, while the 0.1% are upwards of 25% better. And comparing to Steam with Oculus software, it's just better in every single way. That's also the case with Virtual Desktop when you compare it to Steam Link, with both of them running Steam. It has about 10% better 0.1% low and 4% improved 1% low. The performance by Oculus, even with a native runtime, is so much worse it's hard to recommend using it all. Interestingly, Virtual Desktop with OpenComposite to avoid SteamVR and VDXR actually gains a few percent and 1% low in average FPS over SteamVR, but running VD normally has nearly 14% better 0.1% low, which to me is just not a worthwhile trade-off. Now we have Riven, which is a game that has bugged spacewarp I could not toggle off, so that's why the native Oculus results look so poor. But I want to show what happens if you try turning it off and the game says no. If we look at Steam Link versus VD though, it's actually a pretty close race when both use Steam. Virtual Desktop has 4.1% better average FPS and 1% low, while Steam Link has 11% better 0.1% low. However, VDXR is the winner with everything about 7 to 8% better than Steam Link. Versus Virtual Desktop with SteamVR, it's only a few percent better, but the 0.1% low went from 42 FPS to 50, a massive 20% improvement, which you are absolutely gonna feel. Quite importantly, VDXR manages to hit above 90 FPS on average, which is an incredibly important threshold to hit in VR. If we flip over to the frame times with VDXR, Steam Link, and Airlink, we can see exactly how things get so screwed up trying to disable spacewarp. You can see exactly where it turns on and off by how the frame time graph goes from this very consistent roughly 16 milliseconds, and 60 FPS corresponds to 16.6 milliseconds frame time, down towards a similar area as the other runtimes because spacewarp is no longer capping the frame rate to 60. But this lasts only briefly, with it turning on and off multiple times. This really doesn't feel good in the headset, because if I left spacewarp enabled, these spikes don't really happen. If you like meta spacewarp, then this isn't really a big deal, since by default it'll always run with it on if you can't hit your target hertz. But if you're somebody who just can't stand motion smoothing techniques of any kind, using their software for this game simply isn't an option unless you drop settings significantly to avoid any drops from your target refresh rate. Just use the other runtimes in this case. And next up is MSFS 2020, not 2024, as this was filmed before it launched, and that game is still sorting launch issues. This was tested with DX11 and DX12 with high settings and DLAA just to ensure I'm not CPU bound. But it was with clear skies over New York and online features disabled. First up is DX11 with some perplexing results. Performance is all over the place, and I'm not even sure where to start. Meta software is doing significantly worse average FPS than everyone, anywhere from 12 to 20% worse, but the 0.1% low are uniquely terrible on Airlink, reaching a mere 17 FPS, while with the native software on a cable, those literally double to 34 FPS. Every SteamVR runtime, besides Steam Link itself, is having major issues with it actually. VD's 0.1% low are down to 22 FPS, and simply switching to VDXR improves those up to 36.76, a staggering 64% improvement. The only runtimes worth using are Steam Link or VDXR, which do trade some blows. Everything else is just crippled. Let's take a look at the frame times to try and understand this a bit better. Looking at Meta's Airlink versus USB cable, we can see that Airlink is, for whatever reason, incredibly inconsistent with many significant spikes that, besides one outlier, the cable simply doesn't have. And I can't fathom why this is, because if it were a network issue in general, then one would think all the other runtimes would be affected, and this happened when I did several runs. But they are not. So MSFS just doesn't like DX11 on my system, I think, considering the results I got with even a direct DisplayPort HMD in another video. If we compare VDXR to VD with SteamVR's OpenXR, it's plain to see that SteamVR has a lot more inconsistency to it, but given how much worse the 0.1% low were, it's somewhat surprising the frame times don't look worse themselves, especially versus what I saw with Pimax on DX11. So the experience isn't quite as bad as one might think, if still not the preferred way to play. Moving on to DX12, things are looking better for everyone. Well, mostly. Meta with Airlink and Steam is having an awful time with 0.1% lows that are about 10 to 20 FPS worse than everyone. And when your baseline is 23 FPS, that's a lot. But Meta software is once again performing the worst. The Link cable is doing better again, but weirdly the best result is with SteamVR and not the native OpenXR runtime, of which Steam has a 10 to 11% better lows with identical average FPS. It is worth noting this run that Meta does have 22% better 0.1% low than Steam Link has, but Steam Link wins back some ground with 10% better average FPS, even if Meta wins with the overall higher margin. Virtual desktop is simply the king all around though. VDXR in particular smokes everyone with 0.1% low of 44 FPS, when nothing else even breaks 39, and 51 FPS 1% low. It's doing 17% better in both than it did with Steam, with similar to slightly higher margins over everyone else. It's even got 42% better 0.1% low FPS than Steam Link does. This is not an exaggeration, but VDXR is so much better than everyone else, including itself with Steam, that it's like a moderate GPU tear jump. And now we're looking at Pavlov, which I had to run 150% in-game res to avoid being hertz limited. Unfortunately, this game was bugged with meta software, both with and without SteamVR, so I didn't bother doing the full run with Steam, and we can't factor these results. Once again, they're here merely to show what happens if you try to disable spacewarp, since I got the runs done anyway. So this is more virtual desktop versus Steam Link. And the results are weird as hell. The average FPS is, once again, quite close, with VDXR having only a 3.6% edge over Steam Link. 1% low are basically identical with an even smaller margin, but Steam Link's 0.1% low are 15% better than VDXR's, a notable win. But virtual desktop with Steam Link instead of its native OpenXR runtime is vastly above the other options. In 1% low, Steam Link and VDXR get about 66 and 67 FPS respectively, while virtual desktop with Steam is sitting at 79, a massive lead. Compared to VDXR, the 0.1% low are better by an even larger 28.5%, but Steam Link holds up slightly better with VD via Steam ahead by only 11%. The performance delta here was so surprising and huge, I had to recheck it a few times to be sure, but nope, these kind of margins were generally what I found. So I don't know why, but I guess Steam is just the best option here. But given the delta, let's check out the frame times on virtual desktop, and yeah, it's readily seen why the results are so bad. In 2 spots, there are frame time spikes with VDXR north of 90 milliseconds. Even setting that aside, VD with Steam generally just has far more stable frame time, though there are a few sections where it gets comparable to slightly worse. VDXR may have points where it does get a lower frame time, but it's pinging between a higher and lower frame time much more, and for a smooth experience, having stable frame time is pretty important. That is also why you see such better lows in the FPS chart. And coming up, we have another demanding title, this time a flat to VR mod with Resident Evil Village, using the upscaler branch with everything maxed out, but RT and a couple things which you have to disable for the mod to function, and using DLAA because this performs so well I was hertz limited otherwise. SteamVR is, with meta software, again, a terrible choice. I honestly thought motion smoothing was bugged here too with SteamVR, but I checked the overlay graph and no, it was just incredibly spiky and inconsistent, which sometimes happens. Interestingly, Steam Link appears to suffer the same problems of bad lows when running OpenVR, performing far better with OpenXR. But the most bizarre result is comparing Meta's native OpenXR runtime with the cable and wireless. Wireless is, contrary to the MSFS results, doing far better than the cable, and I can't say why. Since this would disprove the idea it's solely some kind of network issue and wireless overhead in Meta's software. I don't know if how things are handled in the runtime are noticeably different between the cable and wireless, given the latter has had more focus and updates, but don't quote me on that. This behavior was reliable on multiple runs. Comparing cable to Airlink, Airlink has about average FPS of around 5% better, but the lows are both around 23 to 25% improved. Airlink is actually running so well that the only thing which beats it in lows is the chart topper VDXR. Everyone else, its average FPS is within a few percent of, but its 0.1% low are around 10% better than Steam Link with OpenXR or VD with SteamVR. It's refreshing to see this after it performs so poorly in basically every other game. But despite that, VDXR is the king, smoking absolutely everyone in the lows. It is the only one doing over 100 FPS for its 1% low, while nobody else hits 90 or above. And the 0.1% low are actually so high at 87 FPS, it's tied or better than the 1% low for all but 2 results. Virtual desktop is just the best way to run this, but Meta's native software is, for once, also good. Just for curiosity's sake, here's the frame time plot on Airlink versus the Link cable. For whatever reason, Airlink is just vastly more stable on frame pacing than the cable, which has quite numerous spikes to it. It's so odd to me that wireless could perform that much better here, but given this and the MSFS results, I guess it simply further complicates matters of chasing the best performance on native Oculus software. Not too much to say, so let's move on. Closing things out with a very popular game which requires OpenComposite for OpenXR, we have Skyrim. This was tested with the September 29th update on Mad God's Overhaul at stock settings, save DLAA, and VR FPS stabilizer with depth culling and TAA to help avoid being Hertz limited or CPU bound. Steam Link was not tested with OpenComposite since SteamVR is the only runtime you can use with it, and using it with Steam generally causes performance regression. I had another video about that. If using Meta's software, SteamVR is objectively a terrible choice, and it's better to use the OpenComposite option MGO has a checkbox for. With both wired or wireless, it provided around a 9% increase in average FPS, and on 0.1% low, saw a 25% increase with the cable and 30% with Airlink. These are definitely meaningful, but I'd say it doesn't matter that much because both Steam Link and Virtual Desktop are, using Steam or not, performing far better. Steam Link's 0.1% low is only about 2% better, but Virtual Desktop with Steam leapfrogs ahead with 65 FPS versus the 53 that Meta has with OpenComposite, a whopping 23% improvement, and leads with a similar margin of 19% over Steam Link's 55 FPS. But the 1% lows are where Meta's software gets blown the hell out. Both Steam Link and Virtual Desktop are 33 to 34% better than Meta's native software with OpenComposite in this area. You will feel that in-game. It doesn't matter if it's running a few percent higher, these margins are vastly outside what you get from a 5% increase in resolution. Not content to be the best Steam runtime by a wide margin, VDXR also has a monstrous lead using OpenComposite. Compared to running VD with Steam, the lows only go up by 3 to 6%, but average FPS rises by 10%, making it the only option to break triple digits. So if you want to use Steam for something like overlay support, you're not at a big disadvantage with Virtual Desktop. But compared to literally every other runtime, it's not even close. The 0.1% low with VDXR are a whole 23.6% better than the next best non-Virtual Desktop option, that being Steam Link. If we hop over to the frame times to compare VDXR, Steam Link, and Meta on a cable, easy to see why this is a mess. Meta's software is all over the place on frame timings and significantly less stable than Steam Link and VDXR. Those two have mostly similar shapes, quite stable, which is good for consistency, but Steam Link has a few more spikes, and VDXR just generally better on performance with lower frame times across nearly the whole scene.
Well, there's the data. Let's talk about some takeaways from this. Namely, the fact that it is, unfortunately, a big reason why VR benchmarking is so complicated and such a headache. Not only can wireless potentially affect the result, I've seen plenty of people mention how one software ran a lot more stable than another one, but the compositor efficiency is also a significant factor. As you just saw, despite all of them running similar resolutions, there were oftentimes significant gaps in performance which could reach over 30% in rare cases. That is like an entire GPU tier of performance uplift purely from a software change. And that wasn't even just from avoiding SteamVR like some people would have you believe. Avoiding SteamVR is not some magic bullet that's always going to get you loads more performance. Let's not keep pretending it is, or that SteamVR native headsets automatically perform so much better. It can be real game dependent. That said, concerning the question of if the Quest specifically is really better off without SteamVR, or if you should just use Steam Link, well, okay, so keep in mind I'm only talking about raw performance, not anything else like latency or compression artifacts. Those may heavily depend on your equipment and your ability to push the bandwidth. Again, this is complicated. However, what's not complicated is that Meta's native software was easily the worst performing and to use by a significant margin, with the sole exception of RE8, where the native OpenXR runtime did rival VDXR and outperformed everyone else by a lot. Meta's software was either noticeably behind Steam Link and VD, often to the tune of double-digit percentage, or it was far more buggy and less stable in general. I couldn't run Kayak VR with SteamVR's OpenXR runtime with it, due to the lagging head tracking. There were a number of games where I flat out could not disable spacewarp when I've never had that issue with any other headset or runtime I can remember, and doing so caused an incredibly spiky experience because it switched on and off at random in the headset, meaning it was worse than just leaving it on. And there was just numerous other little connection issues I simply do not have with the other options. In the spacewarp case, if you like it and you always use it and you don't have any problems since it works fine, but it doesn't let the end user do much for customizing the experience if they do want to disable that stuff, since there's no way to fix it besides swapping runtimes. And given Steam Link is free, unless you're using the cable for something like 960 megabytes per second bitrate, I just can't recommend Meta software because you're losing a notable amount of performance. If somebody else has tried these same games with similar setup and GPU I have and didn't have these problems, I'm honestly curious, and do tell me in the comments below, because it's not simple network issues, happened on the USB as well. I tried 2 PCs, no success. That said, if Meta's software was the worst, Virtual Desktop was easily the best. If you want the best, even just for gaming, that's the way to go, even if you want to stick with SteamVR. VD was often reasonably competitive to even sometimes outdoing Steam Link. Of the 8 scenarios tested, counting MSFS twice because DX11 and DX12. If we consider SteamVR and non-SteamVR runtimes, then Steam Link can't function without it. A Virtual Desktop won first in 6 out of 8 of the tests. If we keep things to SteamVR only for something like compatibility, then it won 5 out of 8, where Steam Link got 3 out of 8. And Meta has 0 in either category. However, I can't say skip SteamVR altogether, even with Virtual Desktop, since 2 out of 8 tests did see VDXR perform objectively worse by double-digit margins. One was more of a case of it gets worse in some areas, but better in others, but 5 out of the 8 did see a general uplift, but only 4 of them did see an uplift of greater than 10% in at least one of the 3 metrics. But that's still a large number of cases to get such an uplift purely by switching runtimes. For Meta software versus SteamVR, kind of a mess. 3 of the tests were bugs, so you can't count, and 4 games isn't the best sample size to make a broad judgment. But just considering those, it was a horrible mix of sometimes you got gains on Airlink, but not on the cable, alongside the opposite. Sometimes you lost performance in one area, but gained it in another. It was just horribly, horribly inconsistent. And given the bugged behavior of spacewarp in some games, I'd actually be kind of skeptical of other benchmarks with the Quest software in case it's corrupting those results without people realizing it. Anyway, if you want to just keep things simple without fussing over all the runtimes and choose this program for this game and this one and all that, for set it and forget it things, I'd say that I recommend either Virtual Desktop with VDXR as a default OpenXR runtime, since more often than not it did help, or if you want to play free, just go with Steam Link. And there is the video. Were you surprised by some of these results? I definitely didn't expect the gap to be so absurd in places, or some of the bugs I found. If you did make it to the end here, thank you for sticking by, and let me know what if you had a similar or different experience in the comments down below. Consider sticking around to see what I do next, and if not, maybe I'll see you in the recommendeds again sometime. Later.